Our last speaker is an artist and also a curator. She's from New Zealand, but now working in Britain, directing an art agency and a public art center that's called The Lighthouse. And what we asked her was to take us towards or through some of the trends or movements of new media artists when they meet with society and societal challenges. Please help us meet Honor Harger.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm Honor. So, as Danielle announced, I'm a curator, and I run a digital culture agency based in Brighton in the UK called Lighthouse. And we work with artists, filmmakers, and technologists on exhibitions, events, productions, films, which really try and show that digital culture is about more than just the tools and the technology. It's not just about gadgets. It's about emotion, aesthetics, and learning. It's about trying to perceive the societal transformations which are being brought about by the ubiquity of digital technology. I'm also an occasional artist. I've spoken at LIFT before in that capacity, and I also blog at Particle Decelerator, where I look at research from the fields of science and technology. And I really say all of that by way of trying to illustrate that what I'm interested in is the confluence between art and technology. I'm fascinated in what happens when artists are thinking just as hard about technology as the scientists and the engineers are. And so today I'm going to talk to you about media art. What's media art? Well, it's a wide set of practices which could be generally described as art made in technologized times. Previous speakers have very helpfully introduced us to some examples of that. We saw Corey Archangel's work earlier. Douglas showed some fantastic examples. So you start to get a sense of the range of practices that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to skim through lots and lots of different examples of works. Don't worry, there's going to be references at the end. There's a website and there's links to everything I'm going to talk about. So why do I want to talk to you about media art? Well, I think that media art could be a source of weak signals about how our world might be shaping up and may give us some clues as to what might be happening in technology space. So, we all know what this is now, don't we? This is one of the most disruptive technologies of our time, I think we'd agree. This is a 3D printer. And it, of course, enables designers or small-scale manufacturers to send instructions to a computer and have objects created to their precise specifications. And I think it really does seem like the very essence of contemporary life. It's been discussed as having genuine potential to change the way that we do manufacturing. This is an example of an object which was manufactured using the principles of 3D printing. Only this wasn't printed this year or last year, or in fact, even this century. This was manufactured in 1923 and is the work of the highly influential artist Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. His so-called telephone paintings were made by sending remote instructions to a manufacturer who produced the painting at a distance. The precise position of the shapes you see were transmitted using graph paper and the factory's color chart. As the curator Stephen Kovacs has observed, his method now appears to have predicted how we remotely transmit data and how we create objects at a distance by over 70 years. So let's look at another couple of examples. This is the work of the artist Edward Inatowicz. He created autonomous robots and machines, such as the Sensor, which you can see there from 1969. The artist Paul Brown has noted that Inatowicz's ideas about bottom-up machine learning were utterly pioneering for their time. His artistic robots used evolutionary systems and adaptive systems and were made using the principles of embodied intelligence. These methods flew in the face of the dominant ideas of machine learning at the time, which were really rooted in top-down notions of artificial intelligence. Tovic's work predated the development of what became known years later as the field of artificial life. And speaking of life, this is 1999 we're at now, and this is the work of a Brazilian media artist called Eduardo Katz. He created an installation called Genesis, a complex, quite beautiful artwork which explored the intricate relationships between biology, belief, technology, and ethics. And amongst the many facets of Genesis is this little piece that I've highlighted for you here. He took a sentence from the Bible, he translated that into Morse code, and then he converted it into DNA. Now, this seems to suggest, doesn't it, that DNA could be used as a data storage mechanism. 13 years later, the media exploded with news of this. A book encoded into DNA, an entire book which scientists had written and they'd stored in the very fabric of life itself. This was designed specifically as proof of concept that DNA is indeed the storage mechanism of the near future. All of that comes over a decade after Katz was suggesting the same thing. We're looking here at what must obviously be a performance using a Nintendo Wii, right? Looks exactly like that. Well, no. This is a piece by French artists Joachim Montessuy and Eleanor Elio, and it was developed over 2 years before the Nintendo Wii was released. It was built at the Media Lab in the Netherlands called V2, a media art lab. And the hardware and the software were designed and developed by the artist specifically for the purposes of creating a media art performance. The examples of where media art has seemed to point at exactly what is about to happen in technology space are legion. So much so that my friend and colleague, the artist Golan Levin, has put together a whole website which is documenting what he refers to as media art prequels to everyday life. There's many examples there of art installations juxtaposed with real-world technologies that seem to mimic the exact functionality of the media art world. He speculates in some instances there may be a direct correlation between the cause and effect relationship between the works. I don't know if that's the case, but perhaps if it is, we could maybe take this even further. Perhaps we could say that the media technology companies have now become so inspired by all of this that they've begun embedding art into the tools themselves. Well, hold that thought in your mind. A decade ago, the media art community created this, locative media. This is art created using satellites, GPS, art about technologically mediated views of geography, art manifesting through maps. This is a decade before Apple started making their own art. Now, whilst I don't think Apple set out to make iOS 6 maps an artistic tool, I think we can really agree that they are redefining the genre of landscape art here. As one person cogently observed on Twitter, art should be difficult. Art should make us question the world we inhabit. Art should take us into the unknown. iOS maps are art. So anyway, jokes aside, what is all this telling us? Are we to believe that media art has some kind of predictive power, much like that ascribed to science fiction? Well, no. I would argue that the reality is much more subtle. Media artists, like science fiction writers, are fluent in what Lev Manovich describes as the language of new media. Their creative perspectives, decision-making, and aesthetics are highly influenced by the interrogation of the systems, tools, and mechanisms of technology. Media artists are engaged in a careful consideration of the social, conceptual, and practical implications of technology, as are scientists and engineers. And therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that they sometimes arrive at the same conclusions, albeit at different times. Their propensity to do so makes the field of media art an incredibly interesting place to look at if you're wanting to detect those weak signals about what might happen next. So, what are some of the messages that we're getting from the media art world right now? Well, one of them is we must be able to describe our environment. The more heavily encoded our world becomes, the harder it is to read. The world is becoming opaque. As technology becomes more ubiquitous, our relationship with our devices is becoming ever more seamless, and our technical infrastructure is becoming more invisible. We now refer to the vast server banks which store our personal data as the cloud. And this really does imply a de-solidification of infrastructure that's very much bricks and mortar. So ingrained has this metaphor become that a recent survey revealed that over half of all Americans think that bad weather affects cloud computing. It's true. At the same time, pervasive automated machine surveillance gives us the impression that machines are watching our every move. Algorithms are loose within the stock market, automatically carrying out trades. Entire cities are being planned for the exclusive use of machines. We really seem to be losing our grasp on what these machines are, and crucially, what our role was in making them in the first place. So this is the media art studio Vice 7, who are based in Berlin. And their artworks explore exactly this. They explore the deep reach of technology in our lives. They're looking at how it shapes both how we read the world, but also what we do in it. Two of its members are Danya Vasiliev and Julian Oliver. In 2010, they became the Men in Grey, and in that guise, they captured and reconstructed data that was hidden in the air. They carried these modified briefcases, which have hardware that can access open wireless networks. They copy the seemingly private data which is being sent on these networks. Emails, images, and private online conversations then appear on the briefcase screens, visible to everybody. You can see that here. The vulnerability of our online networks and what we send over them is made evident in a highly unsettling way. The project makes use of an established technique within computing, something called a man-in-the-middle attack, where data is intercepted en route between two computers. Using their understanding of networks, of cryptography, of code, and also crucially of the behavior of users online, Danya and Julian have made a work that really shows us how trusting we are of our online networks. As they put it themselves, they are the lightning in the age of cloud computing. Their next work, Newstweek, took this idea a little further. In this case, Julian and Danya built a physical device which manipulates news being read on wireless hotspots. As you can see, it just looks like a small, innocuous wall plug, just like a normal wall plug. But the Newstweek device appears part of the local infrastructure, but is actually entailing hardware and software that allows writers to remotely edit news being accessed on wireless devices within a local infrastructure. Headlines on major news, such as the BBC, Figaro, Le Monde, are transformed without the users of those news sites having any idea what's going on. The project is really drawing attention to the role of network infrastructure in the distribution of what we understand to be fact. As the artists themselves say, if you control the infrastructure, you control what is understood to be fact. These projects show us how unquestionably we rely on networks and technological infrastructure for communication and information that helps us orientate ourselves in the world. But we are dangerously unaware of how these systems work and how easily manipulated they are. The artists articulated into these ideas into what they call the Critical Engineering Manifesto. In the manifesto, they insist the world has become so imbued with technology, so encoded, that we now depend on machines, computer networks, databases, and digital automation every day. They conclude, therefore, that engineering, the set of activities associated with the construction and deployment of that technology, is the transformative language of our time. Thus, as artists and actors in this space, they must take a critical approach to the language of engineering. They must expose moments of imbalance and deception. This is really about empowerment. As Julian recently noted in an interview with Rhizome, it's our inability to describe and understand the technological infrastructure that reduces our critical reach. It leaves us both disempowered and also, in many cases, quite vulnerable. We become unable to describe our environment. The critical engineer's objective, therefore, is not just to describe our environment, but to actively take it on. The critical engineer intervenes into these hidden infrastructures, which are so essential to our lives. And they're not the only ones who think that this is important. The creative technologist James Bridle recently described his new aesthetic project as an attempt to make the increasingly complex technological systems that make up our environment more legible. He argues that our ability to read these systems affects the way we see and act in the world, and affects the positions of power we have. As a developer himself, he notes that programmers have a huge amount of agency in the world because they can write and construct the systems that define our everyday reality. Coming from a completely different angle to the media artists who wrote the Critical Engineering Manifesto, he underscores the ethos of what the artists were articulating to us. By designing art objects that are both fully functional tools, but also conversation starters, media artists are giving us tactics, tools, and prisms that make the ever more complicated technologized world we live in more legible. Their work insists that we must be able to describe our environment, not just so we can read it, but so we can write it, so we can actively shape it. Or, to put it another way, can the human mind master what the human mind has made? So what else is media art telling us at the moment? Well, it's telling us something we've talked about earlier today, and that's that technology doesn't just mean digital. In the summer of 2009, the legendary physicist Freeman Dyson set out a vision for the future during a talk in Bristol. He argued that the dominant science of our age is biology. And if the dominant science of our age is biology, then the dominant art form of our age should be the design of genomes to create new varieties of animals and plants. He called for a new generation of artists who could write genomes as fluently as the poets write verses. He wants to see artists who could create new plants, new animals, specifically for the purposes of enriching the ecology of our planet. Well, surely you're saying to yourself, now that's a bit far-fetched, isn't it? Well, no, as it turns out. This is Alba. She's a rabbit. She was born 8 years before Freeman Dyson's talk. And Alba is a green fluorescent rabbit who was created right here in France at the National Institute for Agronomic Research. And she was made in collaboration with Eduardo Katz, the Brazilian media artist that we met earlier in the talk. Alba was engineered by splicing the green fluorescent protein, or GFP, from a jellyfish into her genome. This made her literally glow green under a black light. She was an entirely new form of life, designed as Dyson willed it to be so by an artist working with genomes. And it should be said, a fully functional genetics laboratory and some very smart scientists. Whilst the precise nature of Alba's creation is very controversial, the scientists and the artists very much disagree about this, Katz insists, at least, that Alba was created as a transgenic art project, specifically for the purposes of social commentary. And this is the Tissue Culture and Art Project, a collaboration founded by Oren Katz and Ian Zur. They work with the very fabric of life itself, creating new biological forms using techniques such as tissue engineering. Their work is exploring the new discourses and ethics within the context of engineering life. They've pioneered a concept that they refer to as semi-living life, life that's neither alive nor not alive. In this piece, for instance, which was first shown here, again in France, at Le Unique in Nantes, is disembodied cuisine. This is about the exploration of the ethics of food and poses a possible future scenario about the production of meat, which involves perhaps growing the meat in petri dishes instead of slaughtering animals. And here we've got some images from Laboratory Life, a project that we did at Lighthouse last year. We transformed our arts venue into a biotech laboratory for 2 weeks. It was populated by doctors, engineers, artists, who all worked in collaborative teams. They cultivated bacteria in what we think might be the world's largest agar dish, an agar dish roughly the size of this stage. They bred fruit flies for astrobiology experiments, and here you can see Adam Zaretsky attempting to tattoo DNA. The public could visit the lab, they could watch, they could take part. This was important to us. Science is often happening behind closed doors, and what we were really attempting with this lab was to get the public involved in the production and the discussion of biotech. The results of what the teams produced then began dual lives, both as cultural artifacts, artworks and performances, but also the seeds for what may at some point become scientific papers. So there's a lesson in here. As we've seen, it's often in the field of media art that we see people enacting Alan Kay's famous maxim that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. Media art once concerned itself primarily with digital technologies and tools, but media artists these days are sculpting with biotech. They're working with astrophysics data. They're doing guerrilla gardening. And they're working with neutrino detectors. In the past couple of years alone, the largest media art festival, Ars Electronica, has awarded prizes to artists making solar-powered 3D printers, artists making paintings with nanotechnology, artists making radio stations with bacteria, and artists inventing sailing drones that have the specific purpose of cleaning up oil spills. Alongside artists like Julian Oliver and Danya Vasilyev, they're making works which are actively engaging with the dominant social, political, and environmental issues of our day. So if you're listening out for faint signals about what might be lurking just beyond the horizon, what might be the disruptive ideas of tomorrow, and where the new sources of hope might be, then check out what media artists are doing, because they are, in their own words, the lightning in the age of cloud computing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And of course, that last sentence is also telling us that these are dangerous people. And of course, artists have always been dangerous viruses that should be contained. But at some points in the presentation, especially when you talked about Dyson, I wondered whether there was a risk there. Because you see, in France, we have all those farmers saying that there are GMOs, genetically modified organisms, on the field just next to mine, and it's going to spread. The genes are going to spread, and I don't know what the effect is. And then here we're creating new species. Is there also a discussion in the artist community about that kind of thing? That is, are we doing something really, really dangerous there?
I think that within the media art community, most of the work which is happening within the biotech space or the bioart space is predominantly concerned with ethics. Certainly the Tissue Culture and Art Project, their driver in their practice is ethics. They want to raise ethical questions. They have a laboratory in Western Australia Australia called Symbiotica, and they operate with the absolute very highest standards of health and safety and ethics. We have other artists who are active within the field who, again, have really pushed at the boundaries of where those questions around safety begin and end. Probably most famously, the Critical Art Ensemble, who have done some extremely powerful work on bioterrorism and have got into serious trouble for it. What I tend to find is that the artists who are working in this space, particularly artists who are working with things that could potentially be dangerous, like bacteria, are so conscious about, kind of the questions around health and safety, much more conscious than what you would expect. And they spend a lot of time trying to understand, what damage they could do and then mitigating against that damage.
And then, can you still call those artists new media or media artists?
Yeah, I think you can, because I think media art, kind of, let's say it by comparison to something like digital art, is a wide set of practice which is really about artists discovering, kind of new materials, more or less as those materials are becoming, kind of just, understood by the public. So we would consider in the media art world, kind of a painting made of nanotechnology every bit as an example of media art than something which is using a computer screen and a mouse. Maybe even more so now, because media artists tend to be, sort of a decade or sometimes two ahead of the game in terms of really pushing our understanding about what can be done with new materials. So we're certainly in the media art space looking much more at people who are working with quantum dots and nanotechnology and biotechnology and quantum computing than we are, people who are doing digital photography, if you know what I mean. They're the ones who are going to create the disruptive ideas of tomorrow.
And for the French among us, and there are a few, one of the reasons why maybe I'm asking that is because media for us really refers to communication media. Whereas here we're also talking about matériaux and support. In arts, you would use media for both kinds of things.
But also, we're increasingly finding it difficult to make a distinction about what's a communication media. We heard this in Thomas' presentation, I referred to it here. Bacteria are now being used by, kind of, let's say, the ICT industry as a bridging medium. So the definitions are starting to become quite blurry in quite an interesting way.
So thanks for adding so much quality to our confusion. But this is important, we need that.